Hey guys, Kevin here. I wanted to share with you a new development with the podcast. It is coming to you from a new podcast hosting service, anchor.fm. So far, I'm really impressed. I really like it. Number one, it's free, which is always great. It's also integrated with Spotify and offers some great analytics on who's listening, helps me gain some insight into what content would be good for the audience. And you can also record from your phone, which is a nice new feature that I'm using right now. So if you have a podcast or you're interested in starting one, download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
The You Can't Make This Up History Podcast, bringing you strange but true things from the past. It's not the average history that you learned in school. We're bringing you the heroes and bringing you the fools, and stories that are just too crazy to believe. The stranger than fiction and super unique.
Hi, Lucy. Welcome to Can't Make This Up.
Hi, thank you very much for inviting me.
Very glad to have you. I'm very excited to talk about your new book, but before we get there, tell us a little bit about you.
Well, I'm a journalist originally by training, started on a local paper in a city called Bradford and did lots of coverage of fires and murders and plane crashes and all that kind of stuff. And then I moved to eventually to national newspapers, and I worked for a British paper called The Guardian, and I covered politics. This is some while ago, so it was during the period when Tony Blair was Prime Minister here. And I also covered education and social affairs as well. And then I had a brief period living in Moscow for a couple of years with my family to do with my partner's job. And when I came back from there, I spent some time working at the University of Cambridge, which is quite near where I live. And I worked in communications there. And that kind of was part of what gave me an enthusiasm for communicating science stories in particular. I found that fascinating, and it wasn't the original trigger for getting interested in this story, but it helped prompt me to write the book.
One thing I've noticed with my podcast, I didn't intend to do this, but I also seem to have a very interest in the intersection between science and history. I love knowing how we came to understand the things that we do about science. So your book is really timely. It deals with viruses, vaccines, and it deals with Russia. And I'm sure but
no, I just actually do see into the future. So, I know I'm starting to feel like Nostradamus or something. People are starting to ask me for, bets on horse races and things. No, it's absolutely, obviously coincidental. There is a tiny bit of kind of forecasting, if you like. So to go back, I came across the story for this book almost 10 years ago, so way before everything that's happening now.
Right.
And that was through a chance meeting in a school playground. I'd moved back from Russia. My kids were all going to new schools, and I met another mom in the playground when I was picking up my son. And I explained that we'd moved back and that's why he was starting school. And she said, "Oh, my family has a Russian connection." And I thought she would say, they're Russian. And she said, "Actually, my great, 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 great multiple times grandfather inoculated Catherine the Great against smallpox." I was like, "What?" And I kind of pinned her against the wall while the kids just played around and caused mayhem, and just made her tell me this story. And that is the story that I pursued and just got fascinated with. But it took me, kind of 8 years to actually end up writing it, and with the help of her family. But yeah, so to spin forward, when I finally pitched that, it was 2019. Her family had incredibly kindly said they would pass on the family papers, which included kind of correspondence between their ancestor, that's a Dr. Thomas Dimsdale, and Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia. Extraordinary stuff, his medical notes about her, his
the family had all this.
Yeah, they did.
Wow.
I mean, so they'd kind of shown it to the odd academic previously, and some of it's known, and there are copies of bits of it in the Royal College of Physicians in London, but no one had ever brought the whole story together. I think possibly because it maybe falls between the kind of medical history story and the Russian history story. And in any biography of Catherine the Great, she had a really long reign, pretty long life, and she is such a kind of extraordinary pyrotechnical, just complex character with so much to say about her, even before she even gets to Russia, never mind before she becomes empress. And then there's kind of so much on domestic reform, so much on foreign policy, so much just on her as a person. So in this kind of incredible, dramatic character, this one episode has kind of got lost. You do find it retold in the good biographies of her, but it can't possibly be given its due, or I didn't think it could. The family has this extraordinary amount of documentation. I mean, they have letters that she wrote in her handwriting in French to him. They have his medical notes about her once he'd inoculated her against smallpox. We'll come on to it. And they even have, when you go to, I don't know if it's the same in the States, but if you go to the doctor here, sometimes you might have a kind of medical questionnaire, and it might be like, how many units of alcohol do you drink a week, and what's your diet like, and how much exercise, and and everybody lies about the alcohol thing, and maybe that's just the UK. Just is the UK. And and he gave her that same kind of thing, and there's her notes in French, and it's like, what is my diet like, what kind of exercise do I have, what is my digestion like, and she's jotted down these questions as he's presented them to her, and then she answers them underneath. It's just absolutely remarkable, the intimacy of that. And so to be able to use these documents was really incredible. I have to say, though, it's not like I had them in my little sticky paw and I was looking at them. They're all obviously carefully stored away by the family. And although I think in normal times I would have been able to go and see them for sure, I managed to pitch this book in kind of November 2019. Remember back then when the world was different. And
I remember that.
And I did that. So the reason I was saying there was maybe some level of kind of journalistic forecasting was just that I was interested in this story in the context of the kind of people's views on vaccination, of anti-vaxx sentiment or vaccine skepticism. I just thought that there was this interesting way of looking at people's understanding of risk, their relationship with science, and so on. And I thought that was going to be a kind of current story. So to that extent, there was some level of, okay, I think this has got a kind of news angle. But then obviously COVID happened. My book was kind of put out to publishers in the teeth of all the eye of that storm. And I just literally signed the contract as Britain went into lockdown in kind of end of March, beginning of April 2020. So as you can imagine, all the archive doors just clanged shut, and the libraries, and I couldn't go and even see this family who'd so generously said they'd give me their ancestors' details. That was the end of that. So everything was done through, as sort of online archives and so on, and just talking to the family. And so they actually gave me what they described as a kind of WikiLeaks dump of just hundreds of 18th century handwritten papers, all photographed. So I just had to sit there and just kind of transcribe until my eyes went square.
You prefer.
Gotta suffer for this stuff. No, it's great. It's fascinating. In some ways, it gives you, it's just immersion. You suddenly you're there, and there was nothing else to do. I mean, we had an hour of exercise a day. Just try and write the book around your children and your dogs and your family. Yeah.
Definitely some challenges in putting this together, but I'm sure being in the midst of a pandemic yourself, there's a certain amount of resonance with the material that you're looking at that's a couple hundred years old.
Yeah, absolutely. And without question. I mean, in the most kind of obvious sense, I think that there's just a kind of misunderstanding or a narrow understanding of the history of vaccination itself. Certainly in the UK, people are taught about Edward Jenner at school, and we tend to kind of think, oh yeah, vaccination, it's all about Jenner. Now, Edward Jenner is an absolutely critical figure. I'm not remotely undermining his role. It's extraordinary, but he kind of stood on the shoulders of quite a lot of, if not quite giants, some really tall people, some really important previous kind of scientists, although they wouldn't have called themselves that, natural philosophers, but also other people, kind of campaigners. So just to explain that, what my book focuses on, the kind of foundational technology of vaccination, which is called inoculation. And inoculation was in use in Asia and Africa for I don't know how long, hundreds of years, before the 18th century, when this book is set. But it came to Europe through Turkey, really, and it came primarily through the kind of advocacy and support of one woman who is called Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. It's a fine name. And she was this extremely intelligent, very well-connected aristocrat. She went to Turkey, to Constantinople, with her husband, who was the British ambassador there. And while she was there, she witnessed smallpox parties, inoculation parties, where old women would take what she described as a blunt needle, and then they'd have someone who'd had smallpox and had the kind of pustules on their body, and they would take children who were perfectly healthy, take the blunt needle, take a little bit of the, sorry, no nice way of saying this, the pus from the pustules, and then just dab it into the arm of the child. And the children would have a mild case of smallpox. So they're given this live virus, mild case of smallpox, and then they would recover and have full immunity to the disease for life. And so that's a kind of fighting fire with fire. You're giving someone the disease in a mild way, they recover, and then they're immune. And they didn't understand the process of immunity, but they knew it worked. They just saw it as giving the disease to somebody, but in a controlled way. And she had had smallpox herself, really suffered. Her brother had died of it. She came back to Britain and is like, right, this is incredible technology. We have to introduce it. And she convinced the Princess of Wales, who had two princesses inoculated. And so you get this kind of elite of London taking on this technology. And she convinced the Royal Society, the big kind of scientific organization, and they pursued it. And sort of medics around Britain did begin to start introducing it. And you get this kind of rolling process where in Britain it gradually became accepted over the sort of the next decades. And eventually in I think 1755, the Royal College of Physicians formally accepted it as a technology. And Britain was really very early in adopting that. And I think just very pragmatic. This worked. There was no cure for smallpox. 1 in 5 people who got it died. It was an absolutely hideous, horrendous disease that was particularly virulent by the 18th century.
And people were terrified.
Yeah, they really were. I mean, in a kind of almost like they called it the speckled monster, and parents were told not to count their children until they'd gone through smallpox. It was, killed a lot of children in infancy. Everybody got it. That was the thing. It was incredibly hard to avoid. As I say, extremely high death rates. Sometimes, in the peaks of the epidemics, it kind of moved in these epidemic waves around Europe. And in London, sometimes 1 in every 7 or 8 deaths in the whole of the capital would be from smallpox. It was just everywhere. And of course, it's also, it scarred people. It left them disfigured, pustules, left these deep scars, and sometimes also, had other effects on the body. So it was there, visible. It wasn't like COVID where you can't see it. You really knew if people had had smallpox. So it was ever present in the kind of popular imagination and in culture as well. So it's not just the kind of medical aspect. It was you couldn't escape it. So yeah. So just to pick up again on, so inoculation is that fighting fire with fire process. And what Jenna did was to modify that, to recognize that people had begun to work out that you could actually use cowpox, really mild disease, and people would gain immunity to smallpox just as effectively. So that's a far safer process. You haven't got the risk that people who are inoculated could be infectious and actually give smallpox to other people. And so he proved that using a mild disease to fight a really nasty one worked, and that's his enormous important contribution. But he was modifying a process that was, had been going in Britain for 80 years before he published his work on vaccination.
Okay. And science, even today is like that. It's this slow, gradual buildup of many discoveries. And, unfortunately, the way we like to understand things historically is we like there to be like a single cause, or this one person figured it out. But, as you know, that's not really how science works.
No, absolutely. I mean, it works through a process of elimination, doesn't it? It's kind of this is not true, and therefore, this may be true. It's a much slower, less dramatic. It's just not all about these eureka moments. It's and it's lots of people handing on their bit of the puzzle to the next person, and that was a real kind of not exactly a revelation, but it was very powerful to me when I looked at this. It's actually really interesting. You can find all these treaties and kind of discussions that so many of them are online and available in archives of that these doctors and people were writing in the 18th century about smallpox and how to treat it. And they had these networks of knowledge that really were extraordinarily effective. My Dr. Thomas Dimsdale, his work was read across Europe. It was translated into 4 different languages, went through various editions. It went off to the United States or to America. They really were, knowledge traveled really fast, and people really did pick up on each other's ideas, and you find them quoting each other. Credible networks. It was remarkable, and each person contributing their ideas, and also people they traveled to find out more. So you have the London Smallpox Hospital at St Pancras, and that became this kind of centre of excellence. To which people from different countries came in order to find out how they were doing it, and then they went back to their countries and took that expertise with them.
Now let's move over to Russia. Now, what can you tell us about, Catherine the Great and her background before we get to this moment of inoculation with her? Just what's her background? What's her story?
Well, Catherine the Great she wasn't Russian. That's the key fact. She was German. She was a minor German princess, born in a place called Stettin, on the sort of windy, slightly miserable Baltic shore. And she had an extremely ambitious mother who was from the Holstein family. She was better connected than maybe her father. And she was really looking for a kind of suitable match for her daughter. And so she was related to the Empress of Russia, Elizabeth. Now, Elizabeth had no children, so her heir was her nephew, who was to become Peter III of Russia. And she was looking for a suitable wife for him. And so in the end, Catherine was betrothed to him, and she traveled to Russia with her mother at 14 and converted to Orthodoxy from Lutheranism and married him very young. It was a very kind of difficult, complicated relationship. He'd had a really difficult upbringing, lots of parade grounds, and he liked to play soldiers even as an adult. He seemed to have terrible problems kind of forging relationships with people. He certainly didn't really get on with Catherine after this kind of initial period. He was quite violent and very difficult to deal with. And she spent her time while they were kind of almost waiting to inherit the throne, or he was, reading a lot of political philosophy, informing herself, and developing her ideas, whereas he really didn't. And eventually in 1762, Elizabeth died and Peter became emperor, but was really quite unstable. He kind of had liberalizing tendencies, but he just was such an erratic character. He was a difficult person to have on the throne. And he had a lover, and there was even talk of him putting Catherine in a monastery, in a nunnery, and kind of marginalizing her. At which point, backed up by the army, she launched a coup against her own husband in 1762 and ousted him. So she comes to power through a coup, and then I think about 6 days later, he was murdered by his guards, and no one knows what she knew of that. And I think that the sort of consensus is that she didn't kind of order that, but that it's clearly in her interest, in a sense. Once he's gone, it's a clearer path to power. So she's empress, but she's a usurper. She has to establish herself extremely quickly. So she has a very quick, elaborate coronation in Moscow, very sort of strong, powerful imagery of the Orthodox Christian ceremony. And then she sets about establishing herself with a program of reform really quite quickly, and she's extremely keen to present Russia not as a sort of dark, dangerous backwater, but as a Western-facing progressive country. She wants to do that. She understands Russia. Has frustrations with it. She's frustrated, and we see this with smallpox, with the kind of superstitions of people, but she's determined to kind of convince Russians that they're European, and to convince outsiders that Russia is this progressive state, and that she is a progressive, forward-looking, enlightened leader leading it.
Now Russia kind of always had a view of themselves at the time, maybe still somewhat today, of an outsider looking in towards Europe. How did they take to Catherine the Great being a German-born person? Did they look at her as a foreigner, as an outsider?
I think that there was wariness of her initially, but that she moved very fast to establish herself. She published a document called the Nakaz, or the kind of Great Instruction, where she set out her views really on politics, on how the country should be governed, on kind of how a code of laws, what should underpin a code of laws. And she began it by saying Russia is a European state. That is the opening of this document. And I think that that's her kind of, that's her saying what she wants it to be. She's defining Russia as she hopes it will be, rather than as it necessarily was. Russia is, it's a big country, a huge empire, and it's, as today, very difficult to define. People are still arguing. I lived in Russia, and one of the first things that we discussed in a Russian lesson, where we were at the most basic level initially, we were asked, do you think Russia is a European country? That same question. That was in 2010. And I think that tension is absolutely inherent, really, to discussions of Russia. So how did they take to her? I think there were suspicions of her, but she moved quickly. She was very authoritative. She brought her ideas with her. She began reforming health, education, and it's interesting, actually, when you read the accounts of ambassadors. I read sort of the British ambassadors' accounts of her, and you get these perceptions of her, and there's definitely this kind of real skepticism. Who is this woman? And she's a usurper, and how stable is she going to be on the throne? And Russia's unpredictable. But by the time of the story I tell in 1768, I'd say she's really solidified herself, and the ambassadors are saying, this is stable now. She's here to stay, and she is projecting this notion of herself as the kind of little mother of the Matushka, little mother of the Russian people, and that she was there to look after them, to protect them, and to project Russia abroad, and to tell the Russians, you are European within. So she had these kind of differing messages depending on who she was speaking to.
Hey guys. I want to say thank you for being a listener of this podcast. I hope you're enjoying it and that you're learning a lot. I wanted to take a moment to tell you about a way that you can support the podcast through the show's Patreon. Over at patreon.com, you can support the show for as little as $1 a month. You can contribute whatever you feel the show is worth, and supporters get some extra perks, such as bonus Q&A episodes with some of my guests, the opportunities to submit listener questions, and then supporters get early access to all episodes about a week before anybody else. So if you're interested in supporting the podcast, head over to patreon.com/CMTUhistory. One way you can support the podcast that is absolutely free is you can like the show on whatever app you like to listen to podcasts on, write a little review. Those things are immensely helpful in getting the show some exposure to new listeners. You can also follow the show on social media. I am on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. All of them are at CMTU History. All right, thanks for listening, guys. Now back to our interview. Now, how did she become aware of Thomas Dimsdale and his work?
Well, so 1768, she'd spent, there were epidemics of smallpox kind of sweeping around and coming into St. Petersburg and threatening her own palace. The thing with smallpox, it's not a disease of poverty. This can attack anybody at any time. And she had moved out some of the time with her son to palaces outside St. Petersburg to escape the disease. She was very frightened of it, and she hadn't had it, so quite unusual. And she didn't like that fact. I mean, that's very bad politically, to be outside of the seat of power. There can be plotting. She was well aware of that, of course. And also, I think she just felt dishonorable. She was kind of escaping.
Mm-hmm.
And so she was determined that she needed to do something about this threat of smallpox. And she already knew actually about inoculation. She'd come across it a few years previously, and had suggested having her son inoculated. Her advisors had told her, no, you're not going to do it. So she still had this idea. And this time they said, yes, go ahead. So she sent a message to her ambassador in London and said, find me the kind of top inoculator. Britain's a center of excellence. Find me the top guy. So the ambassador asked his networks, and he approached a quite famous Quaker doctor in London called John Fothergill, who he knew, a very well-connected doctor. And John Fothergill knew Thomas Dimsdale as this kind of very experienced inoculator and a fellow Quaker, or Quaker born. So the ambassador met Thomas, said to him, look, we've got this project for you in Russia. Didn't really say it was to inoculate the Empress. And Thomas Dimsdale said, well, I've got this big family. I'm 56. I've kind of got enough money. I don't really need to go all the way to St. Petersburg. So then the Russians send the message back to Catherine. And then there's another messenger gallops all the way back from St. Petersburg back to London and says, tell him it's to inoculate the Empress. And they tell him, and he sort of realizes it's his duty to accept. So he kind of goes, okay. And then, within a week or so,
Can't say no to it.
Exactly. It's not really a request, more of an order. No, and he, so with his son, who was a medical student, he gets in a carriage, and he's very impressed by the carriage. It's quite endearing. He's impressed because the seats fold back so you can sleep in it, and it's really fast. It's a very
spare no expense.
No, it's true. Very grand carriage. And he and within a month he was arriving in St. Petersburg, and he's put up in this grand apartment next to the Winter Palace. And he's told there's this hospital on the edges of the city across the Neva River. It's called Wolf House, and this is going to be your base for inoculation. And you can run that hospital, and you're here to inoculate the Empress.
Was this controversial action for Catherine to take?
It was kept secret. She was really keen to inoculate her son. She was particularly scared of him getting smallpox and dying, partly obviously as a mother, but because her legitimacy derived from him. And she wanted to protect him. She recognized that she needed to be inoculated herself first. Otherwise, if something went wrong with him, she'd be perceived to have poisoned him or whatever. And I suspect, she wanted to protect herself too. And so she was firm in her plan, very firm, but she wanted to keep it secret. So she publicized the fact that her son was going to be inoculated, but not herself. She kept that quiet. So when Thomas Dimsdale met her, which he did very very soon after arriving, he knew that this all had to be in secret. So he got to know her very quickly and was absolutely overwhelmed on this meeting with her. He found her incredibly impressive, very, very well informed about the science, about inoculation. She really, she'd done her research, and she was very intelligent and very quick, and also very charismatic and impressive. And he writes letters home to his friend Henry in London, which luckily the family also still have, kind of describing meeting her and how overwhelmed he was by her. And they had this really remarkable relationship of mutual respect and just real actual friendship. And I think she saw him as someone very trustworthy. He hadn't asked for a specific fee for this. He wasn't greedy in her eyes. Lots of people obviously would have been. She trusted him as a scientist. She believed in his skills. She didn't like a lot of doctors. She thought they were charlatans, but she definitely believed in him. And they had this mutual respect. He saw her as this extraordinary, charismatic woman with this great understanding of his favorite subject, inoculation, and they got on, and she kind of welcomed him into the Winter Palace, and they spent a lot of time together. He dined with her, he spent a lot of time with her son. So it was far more than just this professional doctor-patient relationship. He was kind of a guest in her palace, really. And he then says to her, well, look, I need to conduct some trials. I'm really concerned that, in case this virus is different here. And she's kind of, well, actually, I just think you could get on with it, but okay, if it'll put your mind at rest. And so he kind of rounds up some little cadets and like young soldiers and does some inoculation trials on them. And they're about 14 years old. And they go really badly. And he doesn't really know why. And Russia was sort of people didn't even necessarily know whether they'd had smallpox or not. And so he doesn't know whether people are just immune, and that's why his methods aren't working. So he gets incredibly anxious, and there's this kind of long period where he keeps trialing things and it's not working. It's all quite thrilling, really. And in the end, she calls him to her and says, my life is my own. She says to him, I've kind of looked at the data, and 1 in 5 people die with smallpox, who get smallpox, or actually probably even more in Russia. It was particularly virulent there, I think. And then, inoculation, he had inoculated 6,000 people and they're just 1 death. So that's an extraordinary, success rate.
Yeah.
And she's really about the numbers, and she was able to kind of evaluate risk in the way that we know human beings are really not very good at. She could kind of remove the psychology and just at least say to him, I trust you. And she said, yeah, my life is my own, just get on with it. And then she sends him this message. And at 9 o'clock at night, he sets out from Wolf House in a carriage with a child who has smallpox that he's inoculated, so that he can inoculate her from this child. It's called Sasha Alexander. And he goes by carriage to the back staircase secretly of the Winter Palace, and he's ushered up this back staircase and into her room. And he takes out this scalpel and a lancet that the family still have, and he inoculates the Empress of Russia in each arm, and there's no going back from that.
The family still has those.
Yeah,
that is incredible.
Yeah. They a lot of stuff got handed down. It is. I mean, she gave him many gifts afterwards, and the family has quite a few of those, and even clothing belonging to her grandchildren. So there's actual some really strong connections. It's not even just documents, portraits, diamond encrusted snuff boxes.
I'm sure if there's any museum curators listening to this, they're salivating right now.
Yeah, but some of it's in the Hermitage Museum. There's some bits because the family have kind of, some of it's been passed on. But yeah, no, it's extraordinary collection.
So after having researched this, what are your takeaways on Catherine's leadership?
I think, well, what's interesting is that, I mean, it's not a great giveaway to say that she does recover from this really quite frightening procedure. I mean, he, in the book, Will sort of shares his medical notes, and you find out how she actually experienced this, still risky procedure, and how she recovered. And then her son is also inoculated. And then, so she was out of St Petersburg while she recuperated. And then she comes back into the city with like bells ringing and cannon fire and kind of illuminated buildings and this enormous kind of party and celebration. And then she orders that there will be church bells rung across the empire, and she celebrates in the most extraordinary way. She has a big Orthodox mass celebrating her inoculation and the friendship between Britain and Russia. She has a ballet commissioned that's on the theme of kind of the overcoming of prejudice, with herself as Minerva. She had a play written, poetry. She even had medals cast with again a kind of idealized picture of her as Minerva, and the statement on the back said she herself set an example. So she's absolutely kind of trying to convey to her country that she has done this, she has gone through this risk, she's gone through this procedure, and they should too. So she's using her own experience as a leader to promote this scientific procedure to her country, knowing that people are really superstitious, they are really scared about it, and that she's gone there and kind of done this for them and led the way, and they are to follow. And And so she's kind of an influencer, she's really, really good at image making and at projecting. And she sort of refers to herself in a almost like as this little mother of the Russian people. She talks about herself as a kind of shepherd with her sheep. It's this kind of Christ-like analogies, and so I think in that understanding of the need to lead by example, especially in something which is about the body and the fear that we all know about now, people's concerns over vaccination. She understood that she could say, I've done this. I wouldn't tell you to do anything I wouldn't do. She has a very interesting conversation. You mentioned leadership with Thomas Dimsdale in the garden at the palace where she's recovering. And they're walking around while she's feeling a lot better. And they see some peasants there in the grounds. And she says, I am an autocrat. I could make anybody do anything. I could just issue orders and people would have to be inoculated. But I don't do that because I believe in persuasion. And I think it's a better way to get people to do what I want. So this is a woman who literally is, she could make anyone do anything, but she's deciding not to deliberately. And in fact, she's even bribed. She says, I give these people money to be inoculated. So she's bribing them. And she said that, and she gave them 1 ruble and now they're asking for 2. So she knows that they're kind of, they're playing with her really, but she's willing to do that, to not use the power that she has. And I think it's quite an interesting, that's interesting in the context of compulsion and those discussions now. I think that she didn't do that. But bear in mind, this is very early in her reign, and like absolutely all rulers, she became far more kind of, despotic and controlling towards the end of her reign. But, we're seeing her really quite early on. Right. So it's fascinating. Yeah.
Well, Lucy, this has been a wonderful conversation. I really love this topic. Like I said, the intersection between science and history, totally geek out over that. If anyone else is geeking out over this and they want to pick up a copy of your book or learn more about you and your work, where can they go?
Well, the book is out in the US on the 7th of June. And I have a website which I am literally just about to launch. So they'll be able to find that. It's just search under my name, and hopefully that will pop up and they can find out a little bit more about me and about the book.
All right. Well, Lucy, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, gang. Thanks for listening to another episode of Can't Make This Up. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Lucy Ward. If you would like to pick up a copy of her book, The Empress and the English Doctor, you will find a link to it down in the description of this episode in your podcast app, wherever you're listening. And then I hope you'll stick around for a while. In a week or two, the next episode will be out. I'm talking with Sarah Scholes, who's written an interesting history on UFO culture and the UFO movement. Pretty interesting and timely in light of recent congressional hearings on the topic. And then just after that, I'll be talking with returning guest Dean Job, who has a book on the trail of a Victorian-era serial killer. So some good stuff this summer. I'll see you again next time.